and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting over the Little Witch Academia OVA. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So, the Little Witch Academia OVA is it's something I quite like. I didn't end up watching it until after I'd first been introduced to Studio Trigger via Kill la Kill, but I don't know, like it sort of scratches an itch that not a lot of other anime does, and I think part of it is it's a bit of a novel twist on the sort of Harry Potter genre of, you know, people doing magic at school. And I like the way this OVA starts because it sort of presents magic as obviously magical, but also somewhat mundane in that it's being presented as a show for, you know, children and young kids, those who might not necessarily be part of the magical in-group, so to speak. So, you know, this is something that would never happen in Harry Potter. They wouldn't be bandying about magic to the masses. Just because I think the implication in Harry Potter is that, you know, burning witches at the stake was a pretty popular thing to do, and they're apt to not be burned. But this sequence in the beginning is one that I really like because it shows, well, I guess the majesty of everything. You know, the witch on stage is not just performing magic, she's putting on a big show. She faces down this giant lumbering dragon and manages to destroy it. I could imagine being very entranced with something like that if I were a child, witnessing it in person. So naturally for our protagonist here, she is very taken in by the message that a believing heart is magic. So now we cut to the present day. At some sort of magic academy, they talk about ley lines, how that's where the academy is situated, and how the ley lines are the source of all magic. So already we get a bit of concrete world building as to how magic works. So unfortunately, it would seem that our main character, who was so entranced by the stage show, really doesn't care enough about actual history to stay awake. I can't say I blame her. I've had some really, really dull history classes, and there's so much fascinating stuff that happens in history that I really think if you make it boring, that's a failing of you as a teacher. There's so much interesting stuff that happens that to make it boring is almost criminal. So now we're introduced a bit more thoroughly to Akko and her two friends. They all seem to be outcasts of one variety or another. You know, Akko doesn't really care about her schoolwork. Lot is kinda nerdy, and Susie is too busy, performing alchemical experiments. So in that sense, they're sort of like misfits who have grouped together. So Akko makes it pretty clear for just about everyone to hear that Shiny Chariot, the performer, is why she became so interested in magic. Of course, the resident, you know, alpha high school student, I guess, for want of a better term, knows of Shiny Chariot and is understandably disdainful because that is her character. She sees herself as better than everyone else, so she has to pick on those she views as lesser to reinforce social status. Not to rely on Harry Potter, but she's sort of like the Draco Malfoy to Akko's Harry Potter. And I really do hate to say that, because Harry Potter's just not very good. It's good in that it sort of pioneered stuff and brought it to the masses, but boy, it could have been done better. So, what else would you do at a school for witches other than learn to fly brooms? It's only natural, right? They did it in Harry Potter, so we have to do it here too. And most witches seem to have very little problem. They just sort of jump off the ledge, mount the broom, and fly away, just like that. Of course, Akko, presumably having had a normal upbringing, is rather more trepidatious about the whole broom business. I've already made the comparison a couple of times, but this is really just like Harry Potter. So we just have that sequence where Akko is struggling to ride a broomstick. Albeit in Harry Potter there is outside influence. I think it's safe to say that this is just Akko's lack of ability getting her into trouble. Notably, nobody really cares about her besides her two friends. You would think that watching a fellow student fall to the ground would provoke a bit more of a response. So now Lot sort of puts together what we already assumed. Akko isn't from a family where magic is a frequent occurrence, so she's sort of having to learn on the fly what basically everyone else has already learned when they were children. Similarly, Akko has a deep admiration for Shiny Chariot that nobody else really shares. I can't think of a really good analog. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's like if people considered Bill Nye an actual scientist, like somebody going for a physics degree in college, and they really, really, really loved Bill Nye. That might be a similar kind of thing, I guess. I guess that's kind of where the Harry Potter analogy breaks down, because, Harry was too busy being a nuisance to his aunt and uncle and, setting snakes free and stuff like that to actually look up to anyone. So just like Harry Potter, it's time for the teachers to put the students through something inordinately dangerous. As it turns out, the Little Witch Academy is built on top of a labyrinth, inside which there are monsters and treasures, so the students now have to go down there and find something of value. So naturally, you might think this is a bad idea, because if there are monsters down there, surely a monster could handle, like, a young teenager in a fight, even if they do have magic. Clearly the teachers aren't thinking that far in advance. Considering that they have to keep the labyrinth locked with 3 gigantic deadbolts, it seems like a fairly bad idea to send down students essentially unaccompanied. So at this point in time, Akko's making it pretty clear that her main reason for wanting to delve down and get the best treasure is because she wants to show up Diana. Because Diana is such a snooty jerk, and surely she's not as good as she pretends to be, so Akko wants to stick it to her. Of course, because they're considering delving really deep into a dangerous area, It strikes me as not entirely as sensible an idea as Akko presents it. So just to hammer the message home, we're given a bit of contrast between Akko and Diana. Akko struggles with like this little tiny monster and goes off chasing it, whereas Diana vaporizes something considerably larger. Now, what we have here is an issue I have with Japanese fantasy anime at large. They often use JRPG terms to refer to things in something that's obviously not a video game. I don't know why that is, but personally I find it kind of irritating. Because I can't think of like the last like actual Japanese fantasy anime that wasn't also aping the style of a JRPG. I think that's rather unfortunate in a way. Just because, like, I don't know. Like, a lot of fantasy just isn't very good, and I feel like the better stuff these days comes out of Japan. But even then, they sort of have to water it down. So, as one could have reasonably expected, Diana and her friends are on the wrong end of a minotaur, and now Akko's blundered her way into its path as well. I would think a minotaur is considerably more than any students could reasonably be expected to handle. So, this oversight by the teachers, I guess I just don't know what they were thinking if they know minotaurs are lurking down in these dungeons. So Susie, unfazed as always, it turns out she has an alchemical concoction to take care of the Minotaur. And that really... I guess that really raises questions about why Akko was willing to be Susie's lab rat to begin with, considering she melted the Minotaur into a gently steaming slurry that melted through the floor. So despite everything that happened, Diana's still playing it off cool. She wants to continue delving deeper and find even greater treasures, despite, not being able to handle the Minotaur. So it seems like, despite everyone's best efforts, Diana has still managed to show up Akko. So naturally, this creates more pressure. Akko wants to continue delving deeper, if only to show up Diana, despite the inherent risks. So finally, Diana's friends are showing some good judgment. Considering how deep down they are now, they understand that it might not necessarily be safe. In fact, one of the first things they stumble across is an Iron Maiden, which Diana's friends claim to have been a torture instrument used against witches for centuries. Although, interestingly enough, upon opening the Iron Maiden, a little tiny, dragon, I guess, pops out. It's kind of a scrawny thing. Although, one would think, considering how deep down they are, and considering it was also sealed in an Iron Maiden, it might actually be more dangerous than its appearance would suggest. As a matter of fact, considering it just ate magic and grew, one would assume that it is perhaps actually really dangerous, and their repeated attempts at killing it is only feeding it. So it seems like just like that, there are a lot of teachers who should probably be fired for letting something like this happen. So I hate to do it, but I think I have to compare this to Harry Potter again, because there's that big room that's essentially a labyrinth full of junk. Well, Akko and company have now stumbled upon to such a room. And interestingly enough, Akko seems to recognize a very nifty little trinket in this room. She would have had it too, were it not for the giant dragon bursting through the floor and continuing its way to the surface. It really seems like Diana and her friends screwed the pooch here if the dragon's grown that big. So even despite being singed noticeably, Diana still has the time to sort of put on a haughty routine in front of Akko and pretend to have everything under control. It's clear she doesn't, but, she can't let slip for an instant that she's not entirely in charge of everything. So despite the dragon and everything that had just happened, Akko's main priority is obviously the treasure she saw before. As it would turn out, the treasure is none other than the shiny rod, the wand that Shiny Chariot had used in her shows. Of course, it obviously has great sentimental value to Akko, but whether or not it's actually worthwhile is kind of unclear. Now, speaking of unclear, it's unclear why they didn't just actually seal the doors when the dragon started bursting through, rather than just, close the 3 deadbolts like they did. Because, just closing the deadbolts, the dragon can still poke through and breathe fire. At least closing the door would make a more solid barrier. So the teacher in charge of this little expedition, she directs Diana to help evacuate the students while she holds off the dragon. But I don't know, they spend a lot of time talking considering how tense the situation has gotten. However, the plot starts to twist a little bit. The professor is familiar with the shiny rod, even if she doesn't say it directly. She tells Akko to get that rod over to the stone that has all the magical power and defend the stone. Naturally, if the dragon gets to it and eats it, that would be very bad indeed. But I think what's really interesting is that the teacher remarked about the 7 stars in the rod and how she had thought they had lost their luster, but considering they're all shining again, it would seem to indicate that perhaps the shiny rod is in fact magically potent. So the teacher takes, I think, finally what's actually a smart approach. Rather than trying to directly combat the dragon, she's attempting to lure it off with some nice, delicious magic for it to eat, and in doing so, buying everyone else time to secure the sorcerer's stone. Of course, the dragon is eventually lured back to the stone just because it's a more potent, magical thing. Take that back. Turns out he's actually chasing Akko and company. Perhaps the shiny rod has something to do with that. So unfortunately, Susie can't make magic happen twice. She tries to poison the dragon, but in the end it's only made it that much stronger and more terrifying. I guess it could be expected that it wouldn't be taken out so easily as the Minotaur had been. But between the dragon's blast of fire and their rough landing, Akko's the only one in any condition to stand up to the dragon and protect the stone. Normally, this would be a rather dire circumstance, considering she has no talent for magic. But the shiny rod is finally reacting to the sorcerer's stone. So the teacher shows up in time to take the rod, but she doesn't really have the opportunity before the dragon swats her away. So it seems like this teacher does in fact understand that perhaps the shiny rod is in fact a potent weapon, but she doesn't have the opportunity to wield it. So in a defiant act of heroism, Akko decides to grab the stone and jump off the tower, knowing, at least in part, that she can't really fly. Obviously, she was hoping the shiny rod would transform into her broom like she'd seen it do for Chariot. But I guess that was a little too much to hope for. I think this is a really nice scene here. I like the whole idea of essentially climbing along the dragon's back. But I also like Akko remembering what Shiny Chariot said. That a believing heart is magic right when she's losing faith in herself. And when she does believe, she can transform the rod into a weapon capable of fighting the dragon. So just like that little magic show in the beginning, Akko manages to defeat the dragon in exactly the same way that Shiny Chariot did. I think artistically it's very nice. It really parallels the beginning very nicely. The dragon explodes, and when it does explode, it, bursts into fireworks. So finally, at the very end, Diana intervenes to save Akko from falling to death. Obviously, she can't express any sort of real concern for Akko. She just has to say it was her responsibility to help evacuate the students. Although, Diana does let slip that she knows what the shiny arc is, perhaps indicating that she's a little bit more of a fan of Shiny Chariot than she originally let on. So I guess, despite their differences, the two have a bit of common ground, even if they wouldn't necessarily admit it. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.